Good evening, Facebook. My name is Chuck Fagan, and this is a special presentation of the Better Savannah Facebook page. Going live this weekend with most of the candidates for House District 163. We're going to start off with the candidate who declared first, Mr. Max Sims. We'll get to him in just a moment. We want to stop and thank a few community partners that helped put these questions together. Importantly, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. I want to thank Amanda Hollowell over there for helping put some input in on these questions. And with that, I want to get to our guest this evening. Max Sims, you're running for State House District 163. Give our viewers a little bit about you and introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some questions.
Sure. So my name is Max Sims. I am a Democrat running for the Democratic nomination here in District 163. The district is basically all of West Savannah, everything down to Rein and a little slice down by the Vernonburg River. I grew up here in Georgia in a small town called Gainesville up in North Georgia. Went to West Point up in New York. That's the only time I've ever lived outside of the state. And then came back here and was stationed as an Army officer on Fort Stewart, where I worked in the chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological corps. Since then, I have been an active part of the Democratic politics in the city in this congressional district. First as the second vice chairman of the Chatham County Democratic Committee, and then as the vice chairman for county affairs for the Democratic Party of Georgia in the first congressional district. I am a life member of the Savannah branch of the NAACP, and I live here in Thomas Square with my partner Austin and our dog Luke.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sitting down with us, and thank you for stepping up and running this year. I want to start with what's on everybody's minds, both in our community and around the country. Of course, speaking of the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery, many people today symbolically ran 2.23 miles for the day that he was slain in February. Arrests have since been made. The head of the GBI, Vic Reynolds, mentioned that there may be more arrests coming today. There's a lot to unravel with this case in terms of to unpack about what to do and how to prevent these types of things from happening in the future. Take a few minutes to address this case and what the legislature should be doing in response.
Yeah, sure. This is just a tragedy, and I'll be frank with you. We need to determine how many more young black men's bodies are going to need to be piled up in the street for white America to take a clue on this issue. We are sitting in a situation where it seems like every month there is another unjustified shooting by a police officer, but this is different than that, of course, because these were not law officers shooting an unarmed black man. These were private citizens that shot an unarmed black man while he was just out running. So, there's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot going on. But I think Joe Biden said it best when he said that, we just watched on camera a lynching in the 21st century. That's exactly what it is. And, we've got a situation where people are defending the murderers and saying that, oh, well, he wasn't from around that area and he was acting suspicious, when in reality, he wasn't acting suspicious. He was shot for essentially just being black and being in the wrong area. So we've got to wake up to this issue and recognize that something must be done about this. Now, Chuck, you know me pretty well, and you know that I'm not the type to say that something must be done without also saying what that something is. So let's go a little bit into some policy that be helpful.
Go ahead.
So number one, we need hate crimes legislation in Georgia. My closest friend in the legislature, Matthew Wilson, actually spearheaded this effort in the last legislative session and got it out of the House. Matthew's bill would have enabled the state to prosecute for hate crimes on the basis of sexuality, gender, race, and a couple other protected categories. This bill is absolutely essential to preventing these sorts of things in the future. The only way that we are going to be able to get past this is by making an example of the people that do this. Now, the other issues are, of course, the gun control issue. We have got to make sure that we pass common sense gun reform in this state. Now, some of that needs to happen at the federal level. Some of it needs to happen at the state level. We've got to close the gun show loophole. In my opinion, we should have a national registry of firearms. Nationally, we should ban assault-style weapons. But particularly as it pertains to this case, we've got to make sure that background checks are thorough. Now, it's too soon in this case to know whether or not common sense gun reform would have prevented this tragedy. But I can tell you that we, every day as a society, deal with the lingering impacts of slavery and Jim Crow, particularly in the state of Georgia. And so we've got to address some specific policies that are going to get us past that. And that does mean looking at, affirmative action as it pertains to the state. That does mean hate crime legislation. And yes, that does mean more solid gun control to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And aside from that, also looking at the police brutality issue and how we are treating, police officers. Electorally, of course, we've got an issue that it took the DA about 70 days to do something.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up about that.
Yeah,
the district attorney, as you just noted, the district attorney took 70 days.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be appropriate for the legislature to create a law that would require Georgia Bureau of Investigation review of all murder cases? Obviously, this might be a burden in metro areas like ours or Atlanta, certainly. But again, the local district attorney, seems to have covered up this case for over 2 months. That seems to be a real, technical legal problem if locally elected district attorneys aren't gonna do the will of the law here. Go ahead.
Well, there's a number of things there. On the GBI review issue, I think it's important to remember that the GBI is only a couple hundred people. I don't know exactly how many people it is, but I think it's in the 150 to 200 people mark. It's not a very large organization. So when we talk about reviewing every murder in the state, we would have to find ways to appropriate a substantially larger budget for that bureau.
Definitely we're going to have problems there. Definitely. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure if now is the right time to say that the GBI must review all murder cases. That being said, though, there is precedent in federal law for treating certain situations different than others under the Civil Rights Act. So I do think that there is a good argument to be made that if a murder fits certain criteria, that it should be automatically referred to the GBI. But again, that goes back to hate crimes legislation, because that sort of segregation of cases would not be possible without hate crimes legislation, right? If we don't have the existing legal structure to be able to parse out the cases into different buckets, then we're not going to be able to have that sort of review when it comes to murder cases like this. So I think that what we really need to focus on is making sure that we are putting a lot of scrutiny into our district attorney races across the state, which are going to be up this year. I think that we need to potentially look into the district attorney's office in Brunswick to see if this was a cover-up on more than a media scrutiny level, but also on like a civil rights inquiry level. So I think that there's a lot to be said about how we review murder cases in the state, but I don't think that it's not that I don't think it's necessary to refer murders to the GBI. I just don't think it's particularly plausible.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Mac. It's a tough time. This is not the first time something like this seems to have happened. And, I think the best thing I've seen is that, they weren't arrested because, the authorities saw the video. They were arrested because all of us saw the video. So I think that's a profound statement. I want to talk about, things here back home in Savannah. Recent city elections last year saw a wave of incumbents lose, including 2 aldermen in districts that cover the House District 163rd map. So I want to ask you what your takeaway was from the city elections as you've gotten involved in local politics here the last few years. What you think that means for the elections this year? You're the first candidate to declare for this race this year. Where do you think the state of Chatham is?
Yeah, so I think that the people are very clearly want for change, right? There was a clear mandate that was given in the last election on a number of different issues. And so, clearly the people in this city want the city to be moving in a different direction than it's been moving in the last couple of years. Now, I know I don't need to explain to you, but for the people watching, I think it's important to note that a lot of the big structural changes that the new council wants to put in place are going to have to be referred through the local delegation to actually get those changes made. So with that in mind, I think that we need to look at all of the different proposals that the city council made in their legislative agenda, much of which that were adopted by a huge mandate of the people, and to, put those before the delegation. I think that it would be unwise for the delegation to ignore the sweeping mandate that the council was given on a number of these issues just because it wasn't their election that it happened in. So particularly a couple things that I want to hit on here. Container fees for the port. There was clearly a mandate given by the people to make that happen. That is not something that the city council can do. That is not something the county commission do. That must be done by the legislature. Term limits would of course have to be adopted by council, but would have to first be pushed as a charter change by the legislature. All of these things would have to go through the local calendar, and so would only require the consent of our local delegation to make this happen.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that real quick. Almost every council candidate campaigned on bringing about term limits for the aldermen, and it was included on their legislative agenda this year. Are you suggesting that the council needs to pass a resolution prior to the delegation taking that up on the local calendar, or is it being on the legislative agenda enough for you to go ahead and schedule that local calendar?
If it's on the legislative agenda, that means that it is the will of the council. When I say that it would have to be passed by resolution, what I mean to say is it would have to get passed through the local calendar as a charter change, and then the charter change would have to be adopted by the city council. I don't see the necessity for any additional resolution or legislative input from the council besides the legislative agenda to clearly tell the delegation what they want.
Gotcha. Well, I will tell you, Mac, one thing that has become very evident in these interviews, especially at the county commission level, is that a lot of roads lead to the state,
yes.
Right? The state government of Georgia, really is the end all be all. There's a large parental relationship basically with the counties and cities in Georgia. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to talk about probably one of the most pressing issues. It was the centerpiece of Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial campaign 2 years ago, and that's Medicaid expansion.
Yes.
The COVID-19 pandemic, it's really stripped away and really exposed the weaknesses in our country, and of course here in our state. You think about the three kind of hardest hit areas in Georgia are Atlanta, Albany. These are districts a lot like yours, Mac. They're heavily black. Black Georgians are more likely to contract or pass away from the virus. Black Georgians disproportionately are facing layoffs and furloughs in industries like tourism and hospitality. I want you to talk about what Medicaid expansion is going to mean for the district, particularly in light of the budget cuts that are being proposed by the governor in response to this pandemic. So give me your initial thoughts on Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, so, we live in a district that is racked by poverty. We have an average household income in District 163 of about $35,000. Across the state, we have a situation where about 300,000 people, according to the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, are falling currently in the coverage gap. So what that means for folks watching is that These are people that make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but that don't have enough money to get an employer-sponsored health plan. So, 300,000 that basically don't have the capability to get medical help when they need it. This pandemic is really showing us how critical it is to make sure that everybody has access to quality health care. So we need to expand Medicaid. Back when Governor Deal was in office, they were scared that a Democrat would become governor. Now, the way that the ACA or Obamacare stipulates that this should work is that governors are allowed to unilaterally expand Medicaid whenever they want to. However, since we were scared as a state, the GOP, I should say, were scared that a Democrat would take over the governor's office and unilaterally expand Medicaid, they devolved that authority from the governor down to the legislature. So this is a legislative decision. So we are in a situation right now where the governor is negotiating with the federal government for a waiver to Medicaid expansion. So the way that Medicaid expansion was envisioned to work by the Obama administration is that states would be able to expand it to 132% of the federal poverty level. What Governor Kemp wants to do is only expand it to 100% of the federal poverty level, and also put work requirements in. Now, work requirements, in my opinion, are immoral just because of the fact that they ignore people that have extenuating circumstances that prevent them from being able to work. But what I'm really concerned about here is that we are sacrificing a lot of people in that 32%. So there's about 30,000 Georgians that are not going to be included in the Medicaid expansion. So about a 50%, 30 to 50% drop in coverage, depending on whose numbers you look at, if we take the 100% into the 132%. So the governor's plan will actually expand Medicaid to fewer people. But also, we are already paying for full Medicaid expansion. So the federal government matches 9-to-1 every dollar we put in to Medicaid, and we're already paying for that match in our federal taxes. And so we are actually giving up on free money that we are already paying in order to ensure less people if the governor gets his way. And the worst part about all of this is that if we expanded to 132% of the poverty level, we don't need to get the federal government's permission. We don't need it. We only need to negotiate with the federal government if we want to do less. So we are entering into a lengthy negotiation while people are dying, and we are ensuring fewer people while costing the state more money. This makes no sense. We need to expand Medicaid. We need to expand it fully, and we needed to do it yesterday. We needed to do it last year. We needed to do it when the ACA was originally passed. And every day that we fail to do this is another day that Georgians that otherwise could have been saved could potentially pass away from this virus or any number of other negative health consequences. So we need to expand Medicaid, and particularly in districts like mine, this would mean so much for people living in poverty across the state, people living in poverty here in Savannah, that would be able to access critical care that right now they just can't.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the budgets. The GPPI, again, for those at home, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute is forecasting a likely shortfall of $4 billion over the next year and a half. The governor's calling for 14% reductions across the board. This is after already a 6% cut in this current fiscal year budget, where he called last year. Where should Georgia be cutting services in terms of the budget? It's a $30 billion budget that was originally proposed for next year. Where should Georgia be looking to cut, and where should we be looking to preserve core services and raise revenues to preserve them?
Yeah, so that's a pretty complicated issue. But I think number one, we need to look at where we're going to generate revenue before we look at where we're going to cut services. Now, the reason why I say that is because in 2008, we cut a lot of services out of the budget. And after the Great Recession, we were the only state in the country that never normalized the budget. So we today in 2020, we're still operating at 2008 levels of budget austerity. So, other states in the country are in a position where they have levers that they can pull to cut some fat out of their budget, right, so to speak. Where Georgia, we are already operating at the level where we have no fat to cut because we're still in 2008 level austerity. So what does that mean? That means that we need to focus on trying to preserve the system that we have right now and the services that we have right now, because any cut that we make is going to be a cut to essential services. So where do we make up that budget shortfall? Well, in the long term, we need to reform the constitution of the state so that we can have a more progressive tax bracket, and we can talk about that more in a minute if you would like. But in the short term, what we need to be looking at is particularly to increase the tax on cigarettes. So the tobacco tax that we have in this state, Georgia Budget Policy Institute did a great study on this. If we increase the tobacco tax just to bring it in line with the other states around us, with Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, and South Carolina, we could generate about $500 million in revenue. And so that's a good start, because we've already seen since the beginning of this pandemic a drop off of about $1 billion of state revenue. So increasing that tobacco tax could feasibly cover half of the budget shortfall that we have right there. So that's a good place to start. The other thing that we need to do is look at the ways in which we are generating revenue in the state. So I said a moment ago about, we are capped constitutionally at 6%. I am in favor of a constitutional referendum to fix that, because right now we are sitting in a situation where we are about as close to a flat tax as you can get without calling it a flat tax. Now, flat taxes, of course, are regressionary policy, because if you only make $35,000 like the average person in my district does, then 6% or 5.75% of your yearly income being taken away by the state, that hurts you a lot more than it hurts somebody making $1 million a year that is paying that same 5.75 and still has $900,000 to spare. So we need to look at how we're taxing in this state. We need to look at making our tax brackets more progressive, and all of this comes along with the idea of hopefully getting a Democratic majority in the state house. In the much, much shorter term, as far as where we have the capability to cut. So I think that we need to first look at our prison system. So if we were to stop prosecuting, for instance, nonviolent marijuana offenders, then we would be able to cut a lot of jobs out of our prison system. We would be able to really make a situation where our prison industrial complex in this state does not cost as much as it does right now. So that's one thing we could do. Of course, we could look at legalizing and taxing marijuana, something that I am in favor of and that makes budgetary sense as far as generating revenue for the state, but that the speaker has said that he is not open to. That being said, I feel like if there is enough pressure from the Democratic caucus and from moderate Republicans who see the right way on this issue, that we might be able to get that done. Particularly when we're adding in the fact that, hey, this is a potential revenue stream, a big potential revenue stream, and we really need the revenue right now. So these are just a couple of ways that we could generate the revenue. There aren't very many places that we could cut. In fact, without cutting essential services, really the only place that we could cut is out of the prison system. And the only way to do that is if we make a conscious decision by the state to decriminalize marijuana possession to get those nonviolent offenders out of the prison system. So I think it's a large overlapping conversation about where the money is going to come from and where we're going to spend. But the bottom line is, number one, the Republicans need to be open to the possibility of raising taxes on certain items. And number two, that the state as a whole is going to have to come up with some creative ways to generate revenue outside of proposed constitutional amendments.
I agree with you that the criminal justice system is probably a good place to start. We're going to have the district attorney candidates in the Democratic primary on next weekend. And, One thing that's amazed me in researching for that event is that, there's always a claim that crime is going down, but the district attorney's budget of Chatham County has gone up every year.
Right.
Something like 5% a year for the last 10 straight years. So, it begs the question is what's the correlation? Does it cost more to reduce the crime? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I want to push back on one other place that perhaps the state of Georgia may look at cutting some spending. Right now in the proposed budget for FY21, there's $70 million of the first third of $210 million in bond package financing for an expansion of the Hutchinson Island Trade Center. Do you think this is the wisest use of resources of our bond spending at the state, given what you know now about the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely not. Look, we are going to, again, we're going to have to find creative places to spend, and we're going to have to find creative ways to cut. And there are more impactful ways that we could spend that money than creating a space for trade shows to occupy that are really designed not for the average person that lives in District 163, right? And so this expansion is not going to generate a large number of jobs, and the jobs that it does generate are going to be small, like minimum wage sorts of jobs that don't actually that don't pay the bills, frankly. So we need to spend that money in other places. We need to look at the possibility of, taking all of that money and repurposing it to the other, $1 billion of budget shortfall. I really do not think that, essentially a glorified space for trade shows is the best use of our cash when we're looking at cutting out of our education system.
Yeah, I agree. It's just something that is on the docket right now. I'm sure there'll be a pushback about the construction jobs. Let me ask you this. National surveys, are suggesting a 25 to 50% reduction in sales activities is already occurring through this quarter. It's likely to continue, maybe not as bad as 50, but it's likely to continue for the rest of the year. Given the large drop in sales tax revenue that the state gets a large chunk of its budget from, given that that's going to be, likely substantially lower, how are you going to maintain these services without disincentivizing job creation coming out of this very, very tough economic times we're in?
Yeah, so it's difficult because we are sitting in a situation where, we have small businesses that are probably not going to, some of them probably not going to be able to recover from the lack of sales in the last 2 months. And even then, sales are going to be extremely slow going into the foreseeable future. So, number one, I think that it's going to take some very astute management at the federal government to make sure that this doesn't become some sort of, wicked inflationary spiral. So I think a lot of that sits on the federal government's plate, but particularly on the state's plate. We're going to have to look at the possibility of bonding out for economic stimulus. And I know that decision makers at the state level are not going to want to do that. I know that they're going to, look at our excellent bond rating and see a potential downgrade if we start bonding out essential services and economic stimulus. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to pay the price for 2 decades of economic austerity policy. That is the fundamental situation that we're in right now. Chuck, I wish I could sit here tonight and give you better news than that, but quite frankly, I can't. Because we pulled all the levers in 2008, and because the Republicans thought that lean government with no spending and no social safety net was the best economic philosophy through which to govern the state, we now sit in a situation where there are no more levers to pull. We do not have very many economic incentives that we can give the consumer or give small businesses without bonding out for the cash. And so this is a sad situation that we're in, but I will take every day of the week a downgrade in our bond rating if it saves the jobs and the livelihoods of people in Georgia.
I want to ask a follow-up question because I think you're onto something here.
Yep.
We've seen the federal government, has spent, something like $3 trillion in the last 6 weeks. The Treasury announced this week that they're expected to borrow an additional $3 trillion before the end of their fiscal year. Do you think it's wise to be, waiting on a bailout or, a handout, as Mitch McConnell called it, from the federal government? Do you think Georgia needs to be prepared? And more importantly, do you think Chatham County and the city of Savannah need to be prepared to move forward without help from higher governmental levels?
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to point out that Mitch McConnell did not just call it a bailout for the states. He called it a bailout for blue states, despite the fact that, of course, the red states like Georgia are the ones that are going to have to receive the most cash. So just a point on that. But yeah, I think that when we're looking at waiting for help to arrive, what we have seen is the absolute dysfunction of Washington, D.C. during this crisis and, really for the last 6 years since Mitch McConnell, became the hatchet man for the Republican Party. So particularly since Mitch McConnell is presently holding up the next round of stimulus because he will not pass a bill until they get litigation protection for companies that are forcing their people back to work in unsafe conditions. So I don't think it's wise to wait for the federal government to move on this issue. If I was, the supreme leader of the state, I would go ahead and make the move on this issue because the governor can't do it alone, the state house can't do it alone, and they're unlikely to work together on this issue. So we really have to, work in absurd hypotheticals on this. But if I was the leader of the state and I could unilaterally make these sorts of decisions, I would say go ahead and bond out now. And if we get the state bailout from the federal government, then we can use that cash to pay back the amount that we bonded. But it is unwise, fundamentally unwise, to be waiting on the federal government to move on this. And quite frankly, I think it's unwise to wait for the state to move on this as well. If I was the county and if I was the city, particularly since the city now has such competent leadership, I would go ahead and move on this issue. I would not wait for the state to move on this issue because there's no telling what sort of ridiculous stipulations that Speaker Ralston and Governor Kemp are going to put on potential state stimulus.
I think you're making a great point right here, Mac. The largest single reserves of funding for the city and county are in the special purpose local option sales tax accounts. That's the SPLOST projects that are voted on every 6 years. There's a lot of talk around town, around the legislature, that's, number one, SPLOST laws need updating in general, but that, the cities and counties that have these large reserves are going to need to be able to find a way to tap into that to be able to maintain their local core services, which are, basic fundamental fire, police, water. Every conversation we've had with the county commission candidates, I'll tell you, everybody supports some changes. Mm-hmm. I think everybody's in agreement. Something needs to change with SPLOST. You've seen our questions of these candidates and on the questionnaire about SPLOST. What are your thoughts about SPLOST reform and how to get that done when you're up there in the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, geez, Chuck, that is a big question because there is a lot that needs to be done to SPLOST. So starting at a very high level, we need to, talking about constitutional reform with the way that we do taxation in this state, we need to give cities, municipalities, and counties different tools to be able to raise revenue. At the moment, the state constitution stipulates really three big ways that municipalities can raise money. That's property taxes, SPLOST, and sales tax, and of course fees, but that's not technically a tax. So I am in favor of a constitutional amendment to open up a larger pool of resources and tools that municipalities could use for raising revenue. So for instance, there are plenty of large, like Class A cities across the country that actually have city income taxes. Now they're very small income taxes because they don't want to, eat so much into your pocketbook. But if you thought a 1% tax on people making over $200,000 a year in average household income in Savannah, that would fundamentally change the way that this city operates, and without impacting, the average person that lives in the city or in this district. But that's just an idea. Of course, the impetus on the legislature would be to give the option to municipalities and then let municipalities raise the sorts of taxes that they want to raise. The other thing, of course, that we could be doing as a city that needs to happen to generate some more revenue is container fees. Of course, this would need to be authorized by the legislature and the money would go to the county, but I envision a system where you pay a $1 fee on every container that moves in through the port. And then through that process, the money obviously gets allocated to the county, but then each municipality and unincorporated Chatham County gets a share of that cash as a percentage of the population of the county that lives in that municipality or the unincorporated area. So that's one of the systems that I see as a very good option that I would be pursuing. On your specific question about SPLOST, though, the biggest flaw in SPLOST, as I see it, is that the revenue generated through SPLOST cannot be used for operational expense. So we cannot pay, for instance, code enforcement salary or police department salary using SPLOST. It's supposed to only be used for capital development and improvement. I don't think that if we're only going to give these three options to cities on how they can raise their cash, I don't think that we should be further restricting cities on how they can then use the restricted cash. So that's the fundamental.
That's a great point.
So that's the fundamental basis of what I think needs to happen to SPLOST, is just free up the restriction on what it can and cannot be used for. And then in the long term, look at providing cities with additional mechanisms through which they can raise revenue. The last thing I want to say about this is that I want to see a system where it is easier for municipalities to dive into already allocated SPLOST funds in the face of emergencies. So you could tie that to, potentially the city council or the mayor's declaration of emergency. You could tie it to potentially the governor, or even to the presidential state of emergency that we have right now. You could tie it to any number of one of these things. But I think that Alderwoman Carter raised an excellent point of discussion a couple city council meetings ago, where they talked about the future of the arena project and whether or not this project is still feasible. If we are sitting in an emergency situation like this, I think that it is more than reasonable to say that the city should have the capability to put that project on ice and redirect those funds to more critical services that the city now is going to struggle to pay for.
Yeah, it's a very big issue. I had spoken to Jack Hill about this before he passed away, unfortunately. Right. I think there's some openness amongst Republicans in the legislature to amend some of the rules around SPLOST, given the climate that we're in, because at the end of the day, it's local money, and I think all politicians are for local control, regardless of party. I think, Mac, a real issue I've been here in Savannah for 10 years, and I think for a lot of people here, the big fundamental issue has been this ongoing relationship with Chatham County and the state of Georgia. And it's this extraction relationship where we produce directly and indirectly in our industries and, logistics, port, tourism, manufacturing, education. We produce upwards of maybe $10 to the state budget. It might not be that high, but certainly it's probably $7 or $8 for every dollar we receive in benefits from the state funding. And so, do you see a correlation between the historic poverty in Savannah and that ratio of economic impact versus benefits? And what are you going to do to change that?
Yeah, I mean, it's mercantilism, right? This is colonial mercantilism. So we have this extraction relationship with Atlanta, where we send all of our money and all of our resources from the port up to Atlanta, and then we basically get nothing back. So here's a great example of this. So in the last budget, there was a $10 million line item for certain projects that were all across the state. There was a budgetary miscalculation, and that $10 million dropped down to $1.5 million. Now, one of those projects across the state that we were going to get the money for was a tied to town bike trail that the state was going to construct for us. Now, when that budget shortfall happened, through an issue with the Appropriations Committee doing their math incorrectly, all of the Atlanta programs in that $10 million were maintained, but we lost our bike trail. So this is a very, very small time example of the sort of relationship that we have with the state. We must stop thinking about this as the sort of exploitive relationship that it now is. We've got to consider the facts. We provide somewhere between $7 and $9 for every dollar we receive. That is an unacceptable status quo, particularly when the median income in this city is about $41,000. But of course, the median income in Atlanta is not $41,000. But Atlanta gets all of these special projects, and they get all of these development opportunities and these grants that the rest of the state does not get. We are the 5th largest city in this state, and probably the 2nd largest economy, definitely the 2nd largest economy if you include the entirety of the county in the statistic, which is another reason why we don't get the amount of allocation that we should, because Atlanta obviously is our largest city. But then when you talk about Macon, which is of course a unified city county with Bibb County, and then Athens, which is unified city county with Clark, it looks like we're the 5th largest city, when in actuality we're number 3 if you take the entire county area into account. So we're essentially getting screwed, pardon my language, on several fronts here, because we're getting the short end of the stick when it comes to the way the dollar is calculated, because they're not looking at our county area, and then we're getting the short area of the stick when it comes to the fact that Atlanta just sees the rest of the state as an exploitive opportunity to increase the GDP of Atlanta. We are the state's chief logistics corridor. We provide the rest of the state with their food, with their cheap Chinese stuff, with everything that they need. And what do we get in return for that relationship? $1 on the 9 that we send out. So I think there's a couple things that need to be done here. Number one, we need to elect throughout the delegation active representatives. Carl Gilliard is the model as far as the way that this should work. That, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, we can all agree that Carl Gilliard is an active member of the state General Assembly. That is the sort of activity that is required from everybody in the Chatham County delegation if we're going to start getting the pipers due. So what that means is that we need to elect people that 365 days a year are going to be representing their office and representing their people that elected them. We've got to make sure that you're taking a front row seat in the legislative process, not just during the General Assembly, but throughout the entirety of the year. Anybody that's experienced, and you know this, of course, but anybody that's experienced with the legislature will tell you that all of the work as far as which bills are going to get passed and which bills aren't going to get passed gets done 3 or 4 months before session gets gavelled in at the beginning of January. So if we wait until January to start doing the work, then we're not going to get our fair share. So how are we going to do this? Well, number one, we're going to elect good representation. Number two, they're going to fight every day of the year. But then number three, and this is the important one, they are going to have to work across the aisle with the Republicans to be able to get these things done. Why is this important? Because where are the Republicans? They're not in Atlanta. They're in the rest of the state. There are plenty of Republicans that have these same complaints about exploitive relationships. Jack Hill was one of them. God rest his soul, Jack would talk all day about this sort of thing. And so we've got to reach across the aisle, not just on a political basis, but we've got to reach out to other representatives from outside of Metro Atlanta to build a coastal rural partnership that will siphon some of that money down towards our communities. Because anybody will tell you that the chief struggle on large social issues, of course, in this state, is Democrat versus Republican. But the chief struggle on budgetary issues in this state is Metro Atlanta versus everybody else. So we've got to build.
That's a great point. I want to talk about poverty and the safety net and about two specific policies and issues that you're likely to be dealing with during the next legislative session. The first one is about unemployment insurance during this crisis. There were already disparities amongst Black workers, Hispanic workers, women, particularly women of color. After the last Great Recession in 2008, it took the better part of 6 years for job levels to recover to pre-recessionary levels. The state of Georgia has wide latitude in, what it can do to support displaced workers. Are you prepared to extend unemployment insurance, for the better part of your entire first term for severely impacted workers?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we need to look at. I want to give some context here to this question, though. Our state unemployment fund, if we were still operating at the level that we were operating 3 weeks ago, would have only been solvent for about 2 more months. So I think that probably played pretty heavily into the governor's decision to lift the state ban as quickly as he did to try and get some of these people off of the public benefit. That is absolutely the wrong reason to lift a travel ban during a public health crisis. Not wanting to raise taxes is not the right reason to be making detrimental public health decisions. Real profile and courage, right? Like real profile and courage that we're willing to sacrifice the lives of our fellow Georgians because we want to ensure that we protect the sanctity of our second term over the sanctity of the lives of all of the people that are going to die because of this decision. So this is absolutely unacceptable. Of course, we need to extend out unemployment benefits for as long as we need to keep the public safe. This really, in my opinion, shows the limits of conservative governmental philosophy. It only works when things are going really well. Of course, you don't need to pay out a bunch of benefits when things are going well, right? And the idea being that, if you pay out benefits, it's eventually going to ruin the economy. But that philosophy only works when the economy is already good. When the economy starts getting bad, when people need the benefits, that's when we show that, that the conservative philosophy has an edge to it where you eventually fall off. And at that point, that's why, we got in 2008, President Obama. That's why Bill Clinton had to fix HW's mess. This is why we still, to this day, are fixing the mess left behind by Reaganomics. And so these are the issues that come with our state's, particularly the GOP's decisions to spend the last 12 years since 2008, the last 12 years gutting the public benefit fund in the name of maintaining austerity politics. The idea behind austerity from a fiscal perspective is somewhat solid, that you cut back and use the rainy day fund when the things get bad. But the idea is you have to reposition those discretionary levers at the end of a crisis. This is the same thing that's happening at the Fed right now, that they're not able to lower interest rates anymore because we spent, the last 3 years trying to make a good economy look even better by keeping interest rates artificially low. And so we've got to make sure that we provide for our citizens in this time of trial. And what that means, again, going back to the bad news that I delivered earlier, is that we are going to have to seriously look at bonding out a lot of our public benefits system if we're going to be able to get through this. Because we cannot afford, if we think we can't afford a couple more months of unemployment, just wait until we get a second round of COVID-19, in 4 or 5 months from now. That's going to be what kills the economy. And so we need to keep the state shut down for as long as we need to. And we are going to have to take our regrettable, awful pill and swallow it and bond out these essential services in order to make sure that we are repositioned for a good economic recovery once we come out on the back end of this crisis.
Do you think Georgia should expand the eligibility ceiling for Tanf funds, temporary assistance for needy families? Right now there's something like $70 million in reserves in those funds. Those are block grants from the federal government. Currently I think it's maybe 100% of the poverty line is the maximum eligibility, but the federal government does allow you to go all the way up to 200. Is that a potential program that can help capture people falling through the cracks because of this crisis?
Yeah, so I think you'll find that one of my themes as I've been talking about the COVID-19 issue is that we're reaping what we've sown, right? And one of the things that we are reaping here is the fact that for decades, presidents and administrations and Congresses have been very hesitant to match the poverty line with inflation because they don't want 50 million new impoverished people on their clock, right? So even when the poverty line does go up, it goes up very incrementally, never matches inflation. So that's why the Medicaid expansion eligibility minus a waiver is 132%, because that's what the poverty line should actually be according to the Consumer Price Index. So, when we look at TANF funds, temporary availability for needy families, when we look at these TANF funds, we've got to make sure that they are reaching the people that need it. And when I say that, I mean all the people that need it. And so we shouldn't be letting politics and, essentially games around semantics for what is a poor person. We shouldn't be letting those politics and those stupid word games get in the way of actually helping people that need the help during this crisis. Of course, we should expand the TANF funds. It should be expanded to 140% of the poverty line, which is what the poverty line rightfully should be. 132% in 2008, index that to inflation, and it comes out to 140% today. It should be expanded. And while we're at it, we should take all manner of different programs and just statutorily index them to inflation to include the minimum wage, to include the poverty line, so that we don't have to play these stupid political games next time we have a crisis like this.
Great. One of the biggest offenses against the problem of poverty is great jobs, and specifically great wages. And so I want to talk about a state authority here in Chatham County called the Savannah Economic Development Authority. Currently, its charter allows for the Chatham County government and the city of Savannah to appoint 2 out of 3 of the members of the board. But that third member, that last third gets appointed by the board itself. The Savannah Economic Development Authority makes deals on behalf of the local governments for tax abatements in exchange for jobs, but there's no requirement for independent verification or an audit of those contracts and those deals for promised jobs and salaries. I'm not sure if you can at the state level do this or if the local governments need to do this, but two questions on this. Number one, will you support requiring an independent audit of CETA contracts and deals for promised jobs and wages? And then number two, will you support changing the charter to return those last third appointments of board seats, perhaps back to a rotating municipality in Chatham County, not Savannah, like Pooler, Tybee, Garden City, Port Wentworth? Do you think the other municipalities should have a seat at that table?
Absolutely. Look, we need to look at economic development from a metropolitan area perspective. CETA, of course, is a state chartered organization. It is not locally chartered. And so because of that, it has a responsibility to be looking at the entirety of the state's metropolitan Savannah area rather than just what exists within the city of Savannah borders. So there's a number of changes that I want to make to CETA. So if you'll indulge me for a second to go outside of the boundaries of your question. So number one, I want to change the charter of CETA to amend its mission statement. Right now, the way that that CETA is designed to operate is to be essentially an economic development interest for corporations rather than for the city. How can we bring corporate jobs into Savannah? But I think what we've seen is that the corporate jobs that it tends to bring into Savannah tend to bring their own employees with them rather than building a supply base of employees from the ground up here locally. So I want to change the charter and the mission statement of CETA, tweak it a little bit to make it more developed to make it a little bit more towards the goal of economic development when it comes to the average individual in the city rather than corporate structures that locate themselves within city limits. So I want to take the focus of the organization and shift it from corporate bodies to individuals that live here. So along those same lines, I want to take the board of CETA and put some statutorily required positions on the board. And there's all sorts of different ideas that bounce around in my head for who these individuals could be. For instance, the head of the Housing Development Authority could be statutorily on the board, or the Homeless Authority. Potentially whoever the president of the NAACP could statutorily sit on the authority board. All sorts of different ideas, but really what all of it amounts to is that I want to change the organization's charter to shift the focus towards people that live here rather than corporations that live here, and then also statutorily put important community stakeholders onto that board to bring some perspectives. Because if you look at the, makeup of that board, I'm not going to call anyone out or anything, but if you look at the makeup of the CETA board, what you clearly see based on the titles of the people that sit on that board is where the focus of the organization currently lies. We've got CEOs on there, we've got millionaires on there, millionaires many times over, but very, very few, with a couple exceptions, very few stakeholders that represent the interests that actually affect the majority of people in Savannah. Now, that being said, so that's how I want to change the charter a little bit to address your second question. And yes, I do think that given the fact that I want to change the focus on this board to be more inclined towards the larger metropolitan area than just Savannah itself, I do think that the other municipalities should have seats at that table. To address your first question on the independent audits, I do think that there should be audits of the promises that CETA makes. That being said, I think that they should be audits in the form of reports to the council and to the delegation and to the commission. I don't think that those audits should have necessarily, statutory you know, penalties if they fail to deliver on their promises. I think that whether or not CETA delivers on its promises, number one, is largely dependent on externalities that have to do with the larger economy of the state and of the country. So I think that the reports that should be submitted about CETA's keeping its promises should really be just informative, and whether or not the level that they aspire to is met is really a political question that should be determined.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think we've suggested that there should be statutory penalties, but I think sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Absolutely.
Right. I think the reason I paired these two questions together as well is that if there's even more community buy-in on that board, like both of us have suggested, with potentially, putting a rotating seat or even adding some statutory seats, if it fails, if the report shows that the contracts were not met, then ultimately it's the responsibility of those that were appointed to those boards, and the people that appointed them being, the local commissions and municipalities that appointed those board seats.
Yeah, and I think that, and I recognize that this might sound trite to drag the Chamber of Commerce into things, but the fundamental fact is we have a Chamber of Commerce in this city. We do not need a state-chartered second Chamber of Commerce that also has decision-making capability on discretionary funding. We should have a Chamber of Commerce to advocate for the interests of corporations, and then we should have an economic development authority whose job it is to develop the actual economy, not just the corporate economy.
We've got just a few minutes left, and in our last topic here, I really want to talk about education. Yep. It's really probably the single biggest expense. Maybe outside of healthcare, they're probably close. But the last Republican governor attempted a statewide takeover of schools known as Opportunity School District. Your predecessor that you were seeking the seat for was one of a dozen Democrats that supported this bill. If the state is going to single out failing school districts, district by district, shouldn't they be offering additional funding to fix these broken schools rather than shut them down?
Yeah, so the public school system, of course, the school board has a legislative agenda as well. The county commission submits one, the school board submits one, and the city council, of course, submits one. Every year, for as long as I could find the records, there has been on there a request from the legislature, or a request for the legislature to stop unfunded mandates. And so that's basically what Opportunity School Districts amounts to. My predecessor's vote on that bill was one of the main reasons why I got into this race to begin with. I am so happy and relieved, really, that bill was overwhelmingly defeated in constitutional referendum. And I think that will keep it off the off the docket for quite some time. I don't think that we're going to see a resurgence of OSD. That being said, absolutely not. We should not be, singling out school districts and then saying, you better fix yourselves without giving them the capability to fix themselves. We are in a situation right now where we have this funding formula called the Quality Basic Education Formula. So QBE is a disaster. Basically what it does is you take a bunch of inputs for your school system, you throw it in, and then it spits out a number as far as money per child. And the state then, in theory, gives that money to the school district for them to operate on. Now, the theory behind this funding formula is that no additional resources will be required from the school district to be able to run their business, except for wraparound services, which we'll get to in a minute. But there's a couple problems with the Quality Basic Education Formula. Number one, it's from the early 1980s. Classrooms today look very different than they did in the 1980s. Number two, it is not indexed to inflation. So not only are we funding 1980s classrooms, we're funding them in 1980s dollars. And number three, there is not even a requirement that the legislature fully fund the formula. So, we're funding these school districts at 1980s rates with 1980s classrooms when we even decide to fund them. And generally that only happens in election years. So we've got a number of problems there. And so what I want to see is the quality basic education formula be completely scrapped, start over from the beginning, and make sure that these problems are solved, with also a requirement to revisit the formula every decade. So index it to inflation, make a requirement to fund it, and then make a requirement to look at it again in 10 years. But also, I want that formula to include funding for wraparound services. We should not be in a situation where what zip code you're in determines whether or not you get to do debate or be in the band or be on a football team, right? We should have a system where everybody in the state, every child, has the capability to access these programs. I think I've told you in the past, Chuck, that if debate was not accessible to me as a middle school and high school student, I would not have been at West Point, and I certainly would not be running for office right now. That program in many ways put me where I am right now. And so I want these same opportunities to be available to everyone. But of course they're not, because when the legislature fails to fund our school districts for normal operations, not even including wraparound services, they have to raise property taxes to be able to make up the difference, because that's really, aside from East Bloss, that's really the only outlet that the Constitution gives to school districts to be able to operate. And so what this does is it creates a system where if you're in a rich zip code, then you get better educational outcomes than if you're in a poor zip code. Whereas the starting line should be the same for every child in the state, regardless of how rich the zip code that they were born into is.
Gotcha. Mac, what can the legislature do to reduce top-heavy administrations and school boards around the state? Here in Chatham County, you hear the term 208 Bull Street thrown around a lot. And that is, of course, a reference to the address of the current headquarters of the school board, where the superintendent's office and most of the administration is. By some estimates, it's a large chunk of their budget goes to administration. What should the state be doing to rein in administrative costs at school boards?
Well, again, I think this is where we can use the education formula to our advantage, right? If we set up a system where QBE funds can only be used for schools and cannot be used for district administration, then suddenly there is a much greater incentive on the school board to operate lean, right? And, particularly when you're talking about neighborhood schools, a school, Beach High School over in Jackson Park, has much different requirements for how they should operate than whatever Pooler's main high school is. And so it should be left to principals to be able to decide the daily operations of their school district rather than their school, rather than the school district making these decisions for them. So I say fund the schools using our state funds, and then let the school district itself make up the difference for the amount that it needs through property taxes, make up the difference for the amount that it needs to fund the district level administration. And then you can have the school board members who are elected go to their voters and justify every mill that they have to raise property taxes to be able to fund their own bureaucracy.
It's unprecedented times we're facing. I'm going to give one more question to you here, and then I want to give a couple of updates for the page, and then let you give a conclusion and how voters can reach you. As a reminder to people, the election is on June 9th. The last day to register is coming up soon. Many ballots have already been mailed. I received mine. It's actually right behind my head right here, to my right ear, on the couch behind me. Received that just today. So a lot of voters will be casting their ballots. The last question I have for you is about higher education. The university system of Georgia is bracing for unprecedented cuts. This is just 10 years after the last recession, both gutted the Hope Scholarship and resulted in several universities merging, including right here in District 163 with the Armstrong Georgia Southern merger. What can you do to brace, or stall against these cuts, prevent further mergers? I think, there's always talk of Savannah State being merged into other universities every year or two. That's a big interest of Ideal, a big important interest for local people here.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things on this. I've already talked a little bit earlier about how we can make up for the budget shortfall that we're anticipating. So I'm not going to hit too hard on that since I've already discussed it. But I do think that we need to make sure that our institutions of higher education are still solvent at the end of this. And so, again, going back to the bad news, this is something that will potentially have to be covered by bonds, because we have the three biggest expenditures in our state are the primary education system, the higher education system, and healthcare. Now, if you combine the two education systems together, they're the number one expenditure by far. And so when we're thinking about what are we going to have to raise funds for, what constitutes an essential service, we cannot let the future of our state get hung out to dry because of poor fiscal management on the part of the legislature. So we've got to make sure that our higher education institutions are still solvent, or else it's just going to exacerbate the brain drain problem that we have already in this state. The other thing I want to mention, particularly about Savannah State, is that it is imperative that we preserve Savannah State in its current form. So I do not believe in separating Savannah State from the Board of Regents and creating its own Board of Regents, or potentially an HBCU Board of Regents. And I'll explain why. In this country, we have a situation where Black schools consistently are underfunded. And that's not just in the primary school system, that's also in higher education. And so what I am scared of is that if we separate HBCUs and create their own Board of Regents, number one, from the constitutional challenges that I think that come along with having, separate but equal school systems. But number two is that I am extremely fearful that having HBCUs as their own board would later open the door for future potential Republican administrations to be able to cut HBCU funding without touching the normal college funding pool, right? So this is my fear. And some folks have told me, oh, but Mac, we're never going to have a Republican governor again, so it's not a problem. And I ask those folks, are you willing to stake the future of historically Black colleges and universities in Georgia on the idea that we will never again have a Republican governor? I am not. I do not support breaking these two apart and creating an HBCU Board of Regents. I think that will make, in the long term, SSU insolvent, and I think that will only expedite the process of SSU getting bought up by another university.
I appreciate that answer. I think separate but equal has failed many times before in this country, and it would fail in that regard, in that situation as well. I just want to give our viewers on the page a little update, for those that will view this video later tonight. We will have at least 3 interviews tomorrow for the remaining candidates for House District 163. I do know that Derek Mallow may be unavailable with the activism that's going on in Brunswick. But next weekend, we will have a district attorney's primary debate at 1:30 p.m. Right here on this channel. And also at 5:30 p.m., we will have a debate for the chairman's primary for the Democratic Party for the County Commission. This Sunday evening at 6 p.m., we'll be having our last district debate for the first commission district between Mr. Kevin Hyman and Ben Waniger. Mac, I want to thank you for sitting down with us. Thank you for stepping up to run for office. Please take a minute or two here to wrap up your thoughts and tell voters how to get in contact with you and your campaign between now and the end of the primary.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Better Savannah for putting this on, and also for your sponsors for helping out with this. And really for all of the work that you guys are doing to try and make sure that we get better representation coming out of this election. I want to remind everybody watching how important these races are. You know, we have, number one, these delegation elections that will really determine whether or not the things that we elected this city council to do actually get done. So if you were enthusiastic about the city council elections, you should be enthusiastic about these state house elections and state senate elections as well. The other thing is the district attorney and the judge elections are so critically important. Please make sure that you pay attention to them. We currently have a Republican district attorney. Consider that when you're thinking about the activism that's going on in Brunswick right now. And then the last thing that I want to say, of course, is the thing that I always forget to say and that I always get corrected on after the fact. If you would like to reach out to the campaign, you can go to macforga.com. That's MACFORGA.com. You can also go to Facebook at Mac Sims for Georgia House District 163. You can contact me by email at macsims@macforga.com. You can follow me on Twitter at MacSimsGA, or you can call my phone number, and this one will go directly to my cell phone. This does not go to a staffer, 912-231-7107. And please reach out if you have any questions about anything that I've said here tonight. I would love to discuss anything with anybody that wants to talk about it. Chuck, again, thank you guys so much for everything you're doing and for having me on here tonight.
It's our pleasure. I want to take a quick administrative note and wish our founder and chairman, John McMaster, a very happy birthday.
Yes,
His
happy
birthday's
birthday,
tomorrow
John.
morning. It's actually tomorrow morning, but I'm sure he's watching and is going to be enjoying his weekend off. We appreciate you founding this forum for us to be able to make some change. So
take a break, only for one day. Take a break.
I believe you me, he takes enough breaks for the both of us. With that, Mac, I want to thank you for joining us. We wish you the best of luck in the rest of this primary campaign. Please stay safe on the campaign trail. We'll hope to see you back in the runoff.
Thank you.
Absolutely.